to provide you guys with a little bit of context, who we are, what we do, what kind of research we do here, and then we'll talk a little bit about why hopefully some of what we have to say today might be relevant to you guys. So just to give us a little bit of a general sense, how many people are there? Who's sort of around the table with you guys?
Well, we have a few people here. I think everybody in the room is a librarian. Is that true?
Okay.
Because everybody here has come actually from across southern Saskatchewan and Regina. We're all interested in opening a makerspace in our libraries, but we don't really know what that means. We're all at the very, very beginning of the journey, and we're keen to find out what's happening out there, and even maybe to determine what the real definition of a makerspace might be.
Excellent.
Do you guys agree with that out here in the audience? Is that what you're here for? Okay, I see you nodding heads. Okay.
Perfect. Yeah, so well that's great because that's kind of how we tailored our presentation a little bit. So just I should make sure in advance. I sent a URL with some slides that I created. You guys have that behind you?
Yes, we do.
Okay, perfect. So you can keep it on the opening slide for now. I'm actually just going to pull up those same slides for myself so I can follow along for myself. So that opening slide should just be the title, Librarian Make Me a Cup of Hot Plain Tomato Soup. Did you guys get a chance to see that video we sent around?
No, we didn't. We didn't watch it right now, but I'll go on it first and drink another bit if you can be bored or fast.
Okay, I mean, you don't have to watch it right now. You can watch it later if you like.
We'll watch it after. But I thought it was a great introduction to everything you guys were talking about. I was very entertained.
Perfect. So just to give a little more context about that video too, the reason we chose that, there's an idea so right behind me, what Dan's actually working on, he's using a 3D printer, which I'm assuming you guys will probably, if you haven't seen them already, you'll probably have a chance to see them this weekend, right?
That's right.
Okay, so we have in our lab right now, we've got probably something like 20 3D printers kicking around, some really old ones, some new ones. The one that Dan's using is called a MakerBot, and it's actually the last good working version of a MakerBot called a Replicator 2. And it's the one that started to sort of close in and make it seem like the Star Trek replicator. You know, it was the idea that you could press a button and whatever you request is going to be made for you on the spot. And that's a bit of a problematic thing. It's never quite as promised, and it's something in our research here we encounter time and again that these things are promised as these sort of fail-proof, always on, pervasive, like easy to use and easy to maintain pieces of technology. And from our own experience, and you know, I've been working with 3D printers now for probably 6 years or so, including here's an old one that we put together a long time ago. There's another, that dimension over there is a really old 3D printer in the far corner. You know, we have encountered problem after problem after problem. And it's not just with the 3D printers, it's with a whole variety of the technologies that go into the maker community. Now, that's not to say that you shouldn't invest your time or your energies or interests in them, but it's something that we want to come back to again and again throughout what we talk about today. So the Librarian Make Me a Cup of Hot Plain Tomato Soup is really about things getting lost in translation. And what we're worried about is, as a lot of the promise of maker communities, maker technologies, and so on, almost get foisted upon libraries, that a lot of things are going to get lost in translation. And we want that translation to kind of be as seamless as possible so that you guys can effectively use this stuff and create these initiatives and not have them fail and not dump a whole bunch of money into them and lose a whole lot of resources, time, people's time and expenditures of energy and interest and so on. We don't want to see that get lost, right? So we'll describe that a little bit more as we go through and we talk more about what the Make Me a Cup of Hot Plain Tomato Soup is really all about. But let's skip to the next slide. It's a little bit of an outline. And so we're going to give some introductions here real quick and sort of walk you guys through the outline. So first of all, my name's Gabby Resch. I'm a PhD student here at the Faculty of Information at University of Toronto. I imagine you guys probably all or many of you would have come through a faculty of information if you're librarians, because you probably, at least some of you would have Masters of Information degrees or MISTs or something like that. So our department is the department here that grants those degrees. I actually am ALA accredited, although I've never worked in a library. I'm alone in our group here in that I'm not a I've never been a professional librarian. I work in a library every day. We're actually housed in a library, and I spend probably 3 or 4 days a week at one of many Toronto Public Library branches. But if you're looking to someone for specific professional library expertise, my colleague Dan here has worked in public, government, and academic libraries, so he's the real expert on that domain. But so I'm a PhD student here. The research is sort of at the intersection of a field called human-computer interaction. So it's kind of around how people, well, to make it very simple, how people interact with new computing technologies, not so much old ones, but how to make computing technologies easier for people to use, and more inclusive and more available and accessible. And then I also work sort of in the area of informal learning, and really particularly around quote unquote like hands-on making engagements. And my real interest there is in institutional informal learning sites. I work mostly in museums, not so much in libraries, but there's a lot of crossover between museums and libraries around developing this content. Um, and so I kind of work with computing technologies that blur the boundaries between, let's say, analog and digital, or material and digital, and modes of interaction that kind of work somewhere in between there. So we're housed here at the Semaphore Research Cluster at the University of Toronto. Our research cluster does work kind of in mobile computing, pervasive computing, or ubiquitous computing. So basically computing up the whole world, you know, putting little sensor devices in all kinds of things, and that's sort of what ubiquitous or pervasive computing is all about. And our specific focus is around inclusive design. So creating computing or mobile devices that are more inclusive, that can be used by more people and be friendlier to more and more people. And specifically, we're here in the Critical Making Lab, which has been around for now probably 6 or 7 years. I'll describe more at the end what critical making is, but we do a lot of research around, these days it seems to be a lot around 3D printing, and how to use 3D printing to kind of provoke critical questions about you know, what's happening in the world, what's happening as these things are pushed on us, what's happening as they're pushed on school boards and libraries and museums and so on. So that's, the critical making lab has a much bigger kind of focus, but those we'll talk a little bit about a few of the questions that we do here. So my background is a little more, I'm kind of a hacker, tinkerer, maker, but I'm actually from a little rural town in southern Manitoba. So the first kind of makerspace I ever experienced would be like the Quonset in my dad's farm. And I think that's something I really want you guys for those of you who are new to the concept of what a makerspace is, that's something we're going to come back to again and again and again, that this is not that new. Maker communities are really not that far removed from the DIY sort of attitude that's so pervasive on the prairies. You know, we're talking to people from all over Saskatchewan, and I can certainly say is, you know, being a prairie person myself and being from a rural community, I know a lot of people who would identify, they may not identify as a maker in the sense that it might get thought of today in the way we're talking about it, but I would certainly classify them as such. So anyway, that's enough about me. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Dan here to describe himself a bit, and then we'll start walking through the content a bit.
I'm Dan Southwick. I'm a PhD student in the Faculty of Information with Gabby. Me and him have a tendency to work together on various projects. My specific interests are with material culture, materiality, craft, and intellectual property. I spend a lot of time thinking about what is the nature of the skills associated with 3D printing, what are the translations that we occur when we move from the digital to the physical. And one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot lately is what is the nature of these spaces and how are they occurring? One of the points that Gabby brought out in his kind of introduction to himself was that he's from a culture of DIY labs or garages or things like that. And one of our big hopes from this takeaway from this lecture is that you'll kind of come in an understanding of, you asked or kind of started to think of what is the definition of a makerspace. We push very hard against any kind of idea that makerspaces are defined by technology. They're really defined by an interest in learning how something works. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a technical, well, we get an argument for what technology is, but it doesn't start and stop at 3D printers. It's a much wider.
Definitely, definitely. So I'm just sending our colleague Sarah a message to see if she's online yet. I'm not sure if she is. I'll introduce her though a little bit, and then hopefully we can bring her in on this call. But Sarah is a librarian at the Stacy Engineering and Science Library, or Science and Engineering Library, at York University, and she also coordinates their annual York University Dungeon Hack Fest. And so Sarah and I have presented in the past and had a lot of discussions about what a very critical part of maker culture is the staging of events. And particularly a lot of events around that might be called like hackathons or hackfests. It's probably something that if it hasn't crossed your radars yet, it likely will at some point, that you guys should be thinking about how to stage hackathons and how to effectively bring the community together for some of these things. So Sarah does that each year up at York, and has run some pretty successful events. They've got another one coming up in the spring. And so hopefully we'll be able to get her in on this. And if we're not, if she's if somehow we can't get her in on this call, she and I have discussed what she's going to talk about, and hopefully we can. Oh, she just messaged me now, so we'll see if we can pull her in here. Hang on one second. Do we do this to add person? Okay. Add people. Let's see. Sarah Shuja. How can you guys hear us out there? Are we good?
Yep. Fantastic.
Great. All right. So we're going to add Sarah here. All right. Sarah, can you hear us? Oh, it's still connecting. Okay. All right. Sarah, you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Excellent. Okay, so we're actually on with these guys at Regina Public Library. There's a room full of librarians. Dan and I have just sort of introduced the topic for today, and have just finished introducing ourselves. And you have perfect timing, because I just
perfect.
a little bit of an introduction to you. But why don't you introduce yourself a little bit, and then I'll continue on with talking about the content.
Just before you
Sure.
go, Sarah, we don't have your video feed. We just have your picture.
I unfortunately don't have a video cam on my work computer,
Okay.
so you won't be able to see me, unfortunately.
We'll just imagine it.
Yeah. So my name's Sarah Shuja, and I'm a science librarian at the Stacy Science and Engineering Library at York University. And one of my roles here is I started about 2 years ago. One of my roles here is as an engineering librarian. So my interest in Hackfest or hackathons or makerspaces kind of came out of that organically.
Okay, so what we're gonna, I'm just gonna read. I imagine you guys might have this abstract. I'm not sure. If not, I'm just gonna read really quickly the abstract that we sent out about what we're gonna focus on today, and how this relates to what you guys should be thinking about as you create makerspaces in Saskatchewan and elsewhere. And just so I can clarify, what time do you guys need us to finish?
We don't really have a time frame. The room is available for quite a while before the next presentation.
Perfect. Okay. So I'm just going to walk through some of these themes a little bit. So to begin with, I want to sort of talk about you know, how so-called maker culture, you know, if I could see you guys, I'd probably take a little straw poll and see who's familiar with maker culture, who's seen it sort of advertised in Make magazines. Maybe you've been to Walmart recently and noticed that they now sell multiple 3D printers, or maybe you've seen at Radio Shack or someplace, you've seen these little, I got one right here, these little things called Arduino microcontrollers, or a Raspberry Pi, or you've heard about these things and are wondering what they are. So, you know, as maker culture is becoming more and more pervasive in society, it's also moving into a lot of institutional informal learning environments, libraries, museums, cultural centers. And what's happening as this is going on, um, you know, it's being promised that there's a whole host of new kind of opportunities are emerging from this that will um, enhance the library or the museum, or, you know, I always think in terms of museums because that's where I mostly work out of, but certainly for libraries, this idea that as maker culture becomes more common, more predominant in libraries, that libraries should be the natural home of a lot of this content, that maker spaces really belong in libraries. And we'll both sort of challenge that a little bit, but also talk about why that may be the case. And uh, and more important than just libraries being home for some of this stuff, there's this idea that the library is also the natural home of, or the natural environment for fostering a sense of information literacy, media literacy, digital literacy, however you want to term it. They're all distinct, but they often get sort of conflated. And so there's this idea that a library is the perfect domain for people to come in and learn more about what information technology is, you know, what digital technologies are, what digital media is, or new media. Um, and, and so that's happening right now. There's a lot of funding, particularly in the US, kind of siphon, particularly STEM content. For those who don't know, STEM is like science, technology, engineering, and math. There's a huge amount of research and money going into creating environments for STEM learning. And a lot of that research is or recognizes that schools are often ill-equipped to deal with this growth in STEM learning, or even STEAM learning. I actually like to think of it as STEAM learning, and that's becoming a more common idea, that there's an arts component added into the science, technology, engineering, and math, and that you can't have STEM without having a sort of creative aspect to it. So what's happening, and I mean, this is the reason you guys are there, there's a huge amount of money going into creating a sense of urgency in libraries, in similar informal learning sites, to promote digital literacy, promote information literacy, and to do it with tools like those that are available through the sort of broader maker movement. But along with this kind of promise that the maker movement or maker culture's tools bring with it, there's also a real challenge in building these things, building this capacity in libraries without taking librarians away from engagements that they're already good at. And I think this is something we're going to come back to again and again. You guys are well trained. I mean, I don't need to tell you that. You know you're well trained. You know you've been through years of school, years of work experience, and you may not be prepared to jump in feet first and take on some whole new technology paradigm, take on a whole new kind of curriculum model that you're expected to push out and to create, when you're already very capable of doing this, right? I mean, is there an inherent advantage to using a little microcontroller board to teach someone how to code, when a lot of the fundamental principles that go into coding computer software or building computer hardware are the same principles that you could learn through some simple hands-on mathematics? I mean, the same logical foundations you can learn from an abacus. Should a library maybe invest in an abacus and similar tools like that, and let kids come around and play with those? I mean, I leave it up for you guys to judge that, but you'll see that it's a very delicate balance between jumping in and sort of testing out the technology and creating these opportunities, and getting too invested and saying we're going to commit, you know, 10,000 or 50,000 or $100,000 to creating this big initiative, and finding that you're not able to sort of match the public's expectation, or match what other makerspaces in your community may already be doing and may already be capable of. So that's something we're going to come back to a few different times here. Um, uh, Around this, one of the technologies that's really being pitched to libraries especially is 3D printing. And you can see we have like 20 3D printers in our lab here, and we find them very useful for our research. But Dan here is going to talk quite a bit about why this may be a problem, why 3D printers may not be the best technology for libraries, why it is amazing. It's I mean, to me, I know how they work inside and out. I understand them inside and out, but I almost take a child's eyes to them, and I sit down and watch. I can watch it all day, and it still seems like magic to me after a number of years of working with them. And I can understand that magic because I do a lot of work out in the community. I mentor with a lot of sort of digital literacy groups, and I go to a lot of public events. I have 2 young kids myself who are 3 and 5. So I can understand that magic, and I can understand the appeal to wanting to present that magic to the public, and to for the library to be deemed current and relevant by hosting this stuff. So I can certainly understand that appeal. But one of the things we really want to caution through our talk today is that a number of these things that are being promised, they come with these assurances that they'll work fail-proof 100% of the time, sort of out of the box. It's almost like an Apple way of thinking. You press a button and it will do what you want it to do, and you don't need to sort of work in and get your elbows dirty, and it's supposed to work every time. And they don't always do that. And we want to really emphasize this as you guys undertake these kind of initiatives, that you have to be prepared to sort of get dirty and understand what's going on, and take a sense of ownership over the not only the hardware but also the content and the technology, and develop a kind of sense of pride in the library over what it is that you guys are creating. I don't doubt that you'll do that, but I think this will be really critical to be able to sort of offset any problems that you are going to encounter. Not that you will likely encounter, but that you are definitely going to encounter. And you know, we're really well equipped here to fix things when they break down. You have to be well equipped for the same thing, but
you have to have the desire to be willing to do it.
yeah.
Sometimes when a printer breaks, it's not going to be a 10-minute fix. We had a printer break 2 weeks ago that I was in here for 6 hours fixing.
Yeah, I mean, I was in here on a Sunday night from 4 p.m. until almost 2 a.m. trying to fix a printer for an engagement that I needed the next day. And you know, the expectations may not be as high when the library, well, our 3D printer is broken, but it is something that you need to keep in mind if you do a lot of advertising and you say, hey, we've got this new makerspace, we bought these 3D printers, we bought these Arduinos, we bought all this stuff, and then you can't get it to work. So it's something to be really mindful of, that you have to be prepared to get your hands dirty and get in there and fix things when they break down.
It's also just not the big things as well. I don't know if you can you guys see this at all?
Yep. Yeah.
Okay, if you actually look at this square, it's actually not perfectly, the edges are all folded in and they pulled up. This is because the tape on the bed was wrong. There's tiny little things that can go wrong through at any given print that can ruin the entire print. So it's the patience of always being willing to go back and make these adjustments and these fixes. So there are big problems and there are little problems, and it's learning to balance these problems that is one of the most crucial elements of these spaces.
Yeah. Yeah, so why don't we jump, we're going to jump to the next slide, which is kind of an outline. I'm going to talk real quick through what are our sort of core components we're going to focus on today. So you should see, when you jump to this, it should just say outline, and there's a little bit of a headline there. So what we really want to talk about, you know, as maker culture technology, and we'll give you some examples of what that technology is here, but not just the technology, also the themes and the sort of groupings that are associated with it. As these things are being encouraged in library-hosted digital campaigns or information literacy campaigns, as they're being pushed on them, maybe you have government pressure, maybe you have school pressure, maybe there's pressure from your library board, who knows? As or maybe you've just realized that this is a wonderful opportunity, and I actually think it is. But as this is happening, there's a really wonderful opportunity for you guys to create or foster a sense of collective and participatory culture. And that's what these technologies are really good at doing. That's what we're going to focus on quite a bit is creating, if you haven't done so already. I mean, I can't say I'm that familiar with the Regina Public Library system, but I'm from Winnipeg, or I'm from southern Manitoba, but have lived in Winnipeg. I'm quite familiar with the Winnipeg Public Library system. I've lived in Vancouver, in Toronto for a number of years, and I imagine there's probably some similar themes. And so anything I say about what you might be able to do in your library, I'm sort of inferring it based on my own experience, probably here in Toronto. So what we're going to be focusing on primarily is maker culture technology turning up in library digital campaigns and information literacy campaigns. And we really want this to be an open conversation, so feel free to interject whenever you want. If you have any questions or comments, you can also send us little instant messages here on Skype, or even email me. We can see all that stuff coming in. Or just, have someone interrupt us and say, hey, wait a second, can you please describe this a little more, or tell us more about this technology? And we'll try and leave a little bit of time to have some discussion afterward too. But again, feel free to jump in whenever you want. So if whoever's controlling the slides, if you want to press down, you should get a little pop-up that says Library Making. And so we're going to talk, the very first thing I'm going to focus on is some of the dynamics of maker culture in libraries. Now press down again, or to the right, whichever one brings up the next bullet point. So the next thing we're going to talk about is electronics hacking, a little bit about Arduino microcontrollers, Raspberry Pis, some of these other things you might have heard about. Then we are going to look a little bit at 3D printing. Dan is going to talk a little bit about both 3D printing and design. And the two really shouldn't be thought as separate, particularly in maker initiatives. They are really very joined at the hip and need to be thought of that way. Then we are going to look a little bit at, Sarah's going to talk a bit about hackathons and some of the technologies from the maker community that might be incorporated in them. And then finally, we want to talk a little bit about a kind of information literacy that doesn't always get a lot of attention in mainstream maker culture, but it's a more critical focused information literacy. And we think that's really important for you guys to sort of grow and help foster a sense of critical information literacy that doesn't just look to create job opportunities or produce more engineers for the world, but really uses these technologies to ask questions that are topical, questions that are important to the public, and shares those findings back with the public. And in each of these sort of short discussions, there's going to be a number of themes that we'll reiterate over and over. The very first is that it takes a lot of time to build and support these initiatives. They don't happen overnight. We've seen this happening here in Toronto at the Toronto Reference Library has recently built a kind of a makerspace. It's a little bit more of a digital media innovation zone, but they have a few 3D printers and they've got some electronics kits for hacking. And so that's happening here. There's also a really wonderful example in Innisfil, Ontario. It's about an hour from Toronto. They've created a makerspace there. It's actually beyond a makerspace. They've created a maker culture in their library. So if you Google Innisfil Public Library, one of the first things you're going to see is content about and from their sort of maker initiatives. And what they did was they hired a maker in residence who's not even really a trained librarian. He's an artist and kind of a steampunk artist and does some robotic stuff. And he's in the library every day and he wears a lab coat and he sits around tinkering on things and building projects and doing all this really amazing creative art stuff. And what it has done, and the reason I bring up this example of Innisfil, if he was tasked with building this maker space or maker culture in their library by himself, I don't know that he would have been successful. what he's done and been really successful with there is really brought in all of the librarians, brought everyone involved there to be a part of the process, to really invest themselves in the technology, invest themselves in the engagements. And as a result, they've got a really incredible culture, and it looks like it's going to be a long-term, sustained initiative there in Innisfil. They've actually taken over another building to do it. So again, make sure that you understand that these things don't just happen overnight. They take a lot of time to both build and support. But you can expect that a lot of things will be lost in translation between your public and your library. A second point that we're going to reiterate is that librarians may need to be prepared to both relinquish some of their role as an expert or a domain expert or content expert, but alternatively, they may need to also take a sense of ownership over the technology. They may need to be prepared to build the 3D printer from a kit, or to sit, not just mentor those electronics workshops, but to sit in on them and build their own projects. So that's going to be really important, that you guys should really think about how you can reevaluate the notion of expertise in your library. And Dan's going to talk about this a little bit more later, but finding out what the public expertise is, what they bring to the table, and what they can do to help create this climate for inquiry. And then the third thing, you should really start to think about how these technologies are being represented in libraries. Are they being represented as new ways to produce anything? You know, you press a button and it makes you the cup of tea or the hot plain soup. Are they being represented as ways to create innovation and build digital literacy? Are they being represented as science learning tools? Or are they just, you know, you have to be really careful that you don't get into the habit of letting the public think that they're all about blind consumption. Because it is a legitimate critique that you could look at it and say, hey, you're just making a bunch of little plastic trinkets with the 3D printer or with the little blinky lights on the Arduino. You're just creating a culture of consumption, of electronics consumption. So it's really important that you know you think very long and hard about what you're representing to the public when you produce this kind of stuff. You produce these sort of initiatives. So if you want to jump ahead a slide now, you should be on a slide that says, you should have gone through all of the bullet points, library making. There should be like 5 bullet points on the outline. And now we should have one that says library making, and it's got a picture of me with a bunch of kids, right?
Yep.
Excellent. Okay, so just a little background on that picture. That's from a library here. That's a group of mostly daycare kids, or they would have been, now we have full day kindergarten for junior kindergarten and senior kindergarten. And those guys are all, at the time, would have been junior kindergarten kids. And what we're doing, I'll show you a really amazing little tool. This is called a Makey. Probably see it a little bit here. Costs about $50, a little bit less. And it's got a piece of programming in it that is intended to turn it into something called a human interface device. So the idea is anything that can conduct electricity, and really the idea is your body as a conductor can be part of a circuit. And so what I'm doing with the kids in that picture is each one of them is conductive, and they're each holding hands. And we're playing a little game, this really totally annoying video game called Flappy Birds, except we're calling it Slappy Birds, where we've got a circle of kids, and each one of them is holding in one hand a piece of Play-Doh that's connected to the Makey. So, in effect, bringing them into the circuit or bringing them into the electronics loop. And then the 2 kids at the end of the circuit are clapping hands to initiate a key press on the computer. And this is something we just rigged up in, I don't know, 2 or 3 minutes. Didn't take very long. I don't know how much the kids really understood what was going on or whether that was even interesting to them. But I think it was pretty cool for them to see that they could hold a piece of Play-Doh and slap hands to control a video game. And I, this particular technology is one that I think is a really great one for libraries. It's, you know, like I said, it's about 40, 50 bucks. There are tons of examples online of people being very creative with them. And and there's just some wonderful opportunities for building building stuff that can be reused again and again and again. So the question that I have above that picture, though, does maker culture really belong in libraries? I want to sort of qualify that. You guys have heard me kind of both critique and celebrate this stuff. I actually feel emphatically yes, it does belong in libraries, but there are some stipulations. You know, I think we need to rethink the notion of libraries as kind of musty old places full of stale old books. I'm sure you guys already do this, right? But there's a question, you know, can a library be a place of quiet and critical reflection at the same time that it is the home of a code repository? It can be the home for half-finished electronics projects that get, you know, worked on every week as kids come in on Tuesdays after school. Can it be the home of creative sort of art interventions at the same time that it's still a quiet space, that it's still a space where people can come in and read and have conversation? I'm not really a true library scholar. I feel that it can be everything. I'm a library patron. You know, I'm an active library patron. I'm in a library every day, and I really feel like it can be all of these things. But with your experience, you guys are going to have to reflect on this, whether or not you want your library to change from a place of quiet reflection. I mean, we've had a controversy here in Toronto. I don't think it's that controversial because I welcome it, but over food in the libraries. All the TPL libraries now enable people to come in and eat. So you can come after school and have your snack, or you can have dinner in the library. And I welcome it. I think it's a fantastic idea. But I can also understand why a lot of people would hate it. And the same is going to be said when you have those old sort of grandmothers who are coming in to read their P.D. James books and sit by the window, and you have a horde of screaming kids who are trying to make a video game work that they've been working on for the last month in your library makerspace. And the reason I think that this is problematic is because I don't think they should be separated. I don't think they should be, you know, one should be sequestered or pulled apart or anything. I really think if you want to have a successful maker initiative, it can't sort of be relegated to the basement of the library. It has to be a part of the library culture. And it has to be an opportunity to create dialogue between different people of different technical backgrounds, of different social backgrounds. That's the really critical part, that the library maker initiative isn't just pushed to the side and brought out whenever you need to market how you're being current by, you know, showing off your cool new technology. You know, I've mentioned the sort of STEM curriculum that I imagine is taking over in Saskatchewan as well, or is being pushed in Saskatchewan. It certainly is here in Ontario schools, and definitely in the States where I lived for a long time. But the interesting thing is, as this has happened, you know, when I was growing up in southern Manitoba, we had shop class, and shop class has pretty much disappeared. But in a sense, it's kind of moving to the library. And you'll need to really assess, is this a good thing, you know? When I was a kid in shop class, we used to make ninja stars out of, you know, we'd weld ninja stars together out of nails and things like that. And I don't want to say that these things won't necessarily happen in a library-sponsored makerspace. You have to be prepared for what's going to happen when you get these like wild teenagers like I was, who only want to come in and be disruptive and build disruptive things, because there's a pretty good chance you're going to have to deal with that. But I don't know that you can really escape it. That's the important thing here. A lot of the trends and technologies that we're going to be discussing and that you guys are probably going to encounter over today and this week, from the Internet of Things to 3D printing to collaborative coding, they're already here. You know, hackers, makers, tinkerers, the people who would identify as such are prepared to kind of open up the black boxes that are around technology. And as long as that as long as that attitude is sort of pervasive in society, that people want to take things apart and understand how they work, then there's a pretty good chance they're going to push to do it in places like libraries. So a few tips about how you guys can effectively produce a maker culture, and not just a maker space, but a maker culture in your library, and how to make sure that it's going to be a long-term sustained effort. And I think these are really critical. That some of these Dan's going to mention, some of them Sarah's going to mention, but I'll just run through a few right now. So at the very first, make sure that you guys put a long amount of effort into producing good instructional content. Don't let your content be static. If you're doing, let's say you buy 25 Arduino microcontrollers, and you say, we're going to do, as part of our makerspace, we're going to do all this electronics hacking. We're going to have people build these little sensor kits so they can go around and participate in these citizen science engagements and so on. When you do that, you have to be prepared to give them some guidance. And don't think that people will turn down a simple 8.5 by 11 piece of paper with some instructions on it. We use that all the time. I mean, we use simple, old, like boring old instructions all the time. But you have to be prepared to update those instructions constantly, because the web is already producing a ton of great instructional content for maker culture, particularly on YouTube. SparkFun, which is a site where you can buy a lot of this stuff, has great tutorials. What's that? Instructables. Instructables is probably the best site you can find for coming up with ideas for maker activities. It's like great recipes for doing things. And you have to be prepared to keep up with some of that stuff, or at least point your visitors to that content so that they know where to find it. But on that same token, don't expect that you won't get real experts in Regina who are already totally familiar with maker culture and with the technologies associated with it. They are going to be prepared to come in and help with this. They're going to want to help create this content. And so I would really advocate that you welcome them with open arms, that you get to know what their expertise is, so that when you have a 3D printer break down, you can get that guy who usually sits in the back of the library reading Raymond Carver short stories, but he's a mechanical engineer who built his own CNC machine. You can call on him and say, hey, how do we fix this? Get to know what your patrons bring to the table, what kind of expertise they may already have. And find out also what they want to include. If you're hearing from your public that they don't care about electronics hacking, that they only want to do 3D printing, then really respect and value that. We haven't seen that in a lot of the maker, like library maker initiatives. Where it has been the case is in the really successful ones. So you might look to Chattanooga Public Library in Tennessee. Nate Hill, who's the director of their maker initiative, has done just an amazing job of connecting with the public, and not just connecting with them and telling them, hey, we're going to create content for you, but encouraging them to develop content. The next thing is to not let a single staff member just lead your initiative. It really has to involve the entire staff. The entire staff should care about this and should want to be involved and want to take a sense of ownership and have a sense of pride in it working. And the reason I say this is because there's something that often gets overlooked about maker culture. I bet you every single one of you in the room, whether you know it or not, could be classified as a maker. You probably have done some crafting. You've probably done woodworking, cooking, canning, preserving. All of these things, I think, are part of maker culture. They're part of a desire to do things by yourself or as part of a community. And that's really a fundamental cornerstone of what maker culture is. So I think it's crucial that everybody in the library shouldn't be deterred because they see some fancy new machine that can make a cup of tea when you press a button. But they should say, hey, wait a second, it actually works. So one of the metaphors I use a lot when I'm describing how a 3D printer works to kids especially, I ask any of them, have they ever baked a cake? And all of them will say, oh yeah, I've baked a cake and I always make it chocolate and so on. And I say, well, what happens when you want to put some icing on it? Well, we smear some on, and I say, well, what if you want to write your name on it? Well, we put it in this funnel and in a tube, and we kind of squirt it out and draw. I'm like, perfect. There's your 3D printer right there. You know, so a cook, a baker, is doing something very similar to what a 3D printer is. They're drawing with a material substance. And that's all a 3D printer is really doing, except it's drawing up as well at the same time. It has 3 different dimensions, not just 2. And mind you, a cake does as well. But don't underestimate the fact that you guys already have expertise that you can bring to the table, and so do many of your public. And so here's the really, really critical part. Make sure this is a public initiative. You want to blog about it. You want to sponsor events. You want to team up with other community partners to have these big events, but you really want your public to be involved. You don't want it to be a unidirectional thing where the library is controlling all the content and the library is the one creating the maker culture, and that's it. It has to be a community event. It has to be a community initiative where the community takes a sense of ownership in the library and takes a sense of pride in the library. And we're going to come back to that at the very end when we talk a little bit about critical information library literacy. And one final point on this, one size really doesn't fit all, particularly when it comes to different age groups. When you have teenagers coming in and they want to 3D print their Call of Duty avatar, and they're really engaged. They're there every day after school, and they're doing all this really cool stuff, and they're building little robots that can connect with their video games and so on. You can't expect that a group of kindergartners are going to come in and want to do the same thing or understand the same thing, or that it will be age appropriate for them. And I think that's really critical, to have almost a host of different initiatives as part of this broader maker initiative. But to still remember that there are great opportunities for intergenerational dialogue. I mean, I'm in there with my kids all the time, and I do, as a parent and as someone very familiar with the technology, I do a lot of stuff with my kids who are 3 and 5 and who aren't as familiar with it. So there are still great opportunities for a lot of good intergenerational dialogue. So let's jump ahead one slide. We're going to go to the slide that should have a couple of little hands, and it says electronics hacking. I'm going to talk a little bit about electronics hacking, and then I'm going to hand it over to Dan to guide us through some stuff about 3D. So with electronics hacking, what you see here, this is from an event that myself and one of our other PhD students, Antonio, we hosted out in the community. It was a little build your own sensors with an Arduino and some breadboards. I'd probably have a couple of these things kicking around here. And we're just guiding a bunch of kids through how to do this. Now, how many kids do you know who are 8 or 10 years old can connect wires and understand how a breadboard works? Probably not a lot of them. And so one of the things we did in advance of this event, and this is a good little tip for any time you might do an electronics event, is we prepared cutouts, little outlines. I don't have any of the cutouts here, but we prepared little cutouts that just paper-based cutouts that we would tape on top of the breadboards and on top of the Arduinos. And they would show where to connect which wire. And the kids could sit there and say, oh, okay, I can go to B10 and I'll plug that wire in and then plug it into, you know, my analog pin 3 on my Arduino. And it became much easier for them to get a sense of how the different pieces fit together. So that's what we were working through with them there, making sure that they knew where to poke the holes. The nice thing about paper is you can poke right through it and it makes no difference. So the interesting thing with electronics hacking is people look at this and they say, well, I really have no idea what it is or how it works or what it does. And really, it's almost like a tiny little computer. It's great for building things it's great for bringing things to life, bringing things like if I want my shirt to blink a little blue light, or if I want to have my hat have a little infrared sensor on it that can detect proximity so that when Dan gets too close to me, maybe it sets off an alarm, or I have a little robotic arm that can shoot out a boxing glove and punch him. Almost like in, for those of you who remember the movie Goonies, all the little toys that Data, the kid in that movie, had. So what the Arduino is great at, it can do a lot, it can control, it can be the sort of brain for a lot of those things. And the coding language that it uses is really quite easy and is very well documented. And there are millions of examples all over the internet that will guide people through how to build the code for this stuff and how to load it onto the board and then how to make the board do something. But when you look at that and you say, okay, this is really just, some kind of hardcore computer science hacking project. And in a sense, maybe it is. But there are still a lot of very easy principles built into it. The most important one that often gets overlooked is that in the design process for building any kind of robotics, any sort of sensor kits, we should always be starting with fairly simple ideas. And there's two themes that I want to just touch on quickly related to that. Number one has to do with a way of designing that's very common, particularly in computer software and for building computer interfaces. And it's around the use of paper for prototyping, to do storyboards, to build a sort of paper model for how something will work. That's a great way to engage little kids. We do a lot of activities. I volunteer with a group called Kids Learning Code here in Toronto. And anytime we're building with technology, I always make sure that we have a little core component first around building without technology, inventing without technology. What do you do when you have no technology to invent with? What kind of creative ideas do you come up with? I mean, I like to think of myself here in our lab not as a computer hacker or any of this kind of thing, but more as a kind of MacGyver, because I'm more likely to take a piece of gum and a paper clip and put a few pieces together like that. And I think that's a great way to approach some of these initiatives with kids, or with younger members of your public, to say to them that they don't need to be a hardcore software developer to understand what's going on. They can use and reuse a lot of other code. In fact, I mean, you may have come across this quote from Picasso, or it's usually attributed to Picasso, that good artists borrow and great artists steal. They should always be looking for other people's ideas, not to steal them necessarily, but to be inspired by them. And a great way to do that is to take someone's idea and then reduce it, simplify it as much as possible, and then start with paper. Sketch it out on paper. Sketch it out with simple markers and do it that way. And connected to that idea of starting with paper prototyping is to, if you're going to do any kind of electronics hacking, if you guys are going to purchase any of these sort of things, Raspberry Pis, Arduinos, any of this kind of stuff, I really recommend that any activity that you set up starts with a particular mode of engagement. So that could be around sensing technologies. So for example, you may outfit an Arduino with, let's say, a light sensor or a humidity sensor or a temperature sensor. And so if your thermostat in your house isn't working very well, but your Arduino can tell you that it's too hot in your house or it's too humid in your house, maybe it shuts your furnace off for a little bit. That sort of way of thinking, that the Arduino is, or other microelectronics platforms are really wonderful at creating ways of sensing the world around them. And then communicating the data that's sensed back into what's called the sort of Internet of Things, where other devices can talk to them then. I mean, that's getting a little too far ahead, but it's a way of approaching electronics hacking that's really interesting. Another way is around robotics. And I'm not saying build the next Big Hero 6 or anything like that, but there are very simple, easy robotics devices that can be built into little servo motors and things like that can be built into 3D printed enclosures, or can be embedded in wood enclosures, however you guys go about doing it. But can be controlled from an Arduino and do things like, here's an example. We did I probably shouldn't show you this, it looks like a middle finger sticking up. Let me show you the full hand. So we did a couple of workshops that were around prototyping and hacking prosthetic devices, new ways of thinking of prosthetic devices. And so we had the people who were participants, we had them make a hand out of wax, model it out of wax. In the second iteration of the workshop, we used something called polymorph, and heat it up and melt it, and reform it. And then people would come up with ways of making the prosthetic device become more alive. So if they touch something, maybe it triggers a motor or it makes a sound. Some of them embedded little servo motors in them that would make the finger joints move and this kind of thing. So building very simple robotics around real world needs, like for example, prosthetic devices. Those are great ways of sort of engaging the public around a core theme. And wearable computing. This is a little wearable Arduino right here. It's called a Flora. It's the same thing as the other blue one here, except I can sew it into my clothes with conductive fabric and conductive thread, and I can create a circuit on my clothes or on my body and use it that way. So yeah, some of those things around electronics hacking are really critical if that's the route you guys are going to go. The other thing to really make sure you do is figure out where you're going to store code for future uses. If you're going to create a library-hosted code repository, make sure it's going to be accessible for the future, right? Make sure that you put a lot of thought into how the public can come back to it and use it again and again. And there are plenty of tools. You can feel free to email me if you're wondering about some of them, but for creating simple circuit diagrams. One of the best is called 123D Circuits, and it's available for free online. People can sign up and they can use it to build simple circuit diagrams and to actually incorporate in electronics devices like Arduinos to make that process much easier, but also to make it more collaborative with other people. So I'm going to shut up now because I've probably spoken way too much. I'm going to move on to Dan here. Dan's going to talk to us a little bit about 3D printing. And so if you want to jump ahead in your slides there, you should get to a slide that has, that's Dan standing there at Richmond Hill Public Library here in Toronto, talking to some members of the public about 3D printing. So Dan, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Before I begin, can I get a sense of how many people in the room have used a 3D printer?
I sort of have. Dan, it's Nathan. I met you last year. Can you hear me?
A little bit.
This is Nathan. I met you last year. I did an interview with you at Maker Kids. Do you remember?
Yes.
Yeah. So I've worked with them a little bit, but I'm not really a tech guy. I'm sort of around them all the time.
Okay. So one of the things that I want, we've seen a lot of people have an interest in 3D printers, especially within a library context. And one of the biggest challenges is actually getting people to understand the nature of the technology itself. There's a real push towards a sense that it's a digital technology when we have to start thinking of it more as a physical one. It's not a complicated technology, but there's a very large design chain around it. So not only do you have to deal with printers, but you also have to deal with software and how it translates the digital files out. So I'm going to try and do something. We'll see if this works. Can you see this little squid guy?
Yep.
If you look closely, can you see the lines that move up through it?
Yep.
Yeah, so that's how a 3D printer works. It's drawing the lines around the printer and then slowly moving up. As Gabby described it, it's a cake icing bag. So that's a digital file that's been physically moved out. And what you have to do is using design software, you have to create something, or you can download something and produce it out. The challenge is getting someone to understand how the printer is going to create these objects. So within the Critical Making Lab, we've been working around an idea using Lego and paper to explain how 3D printing works. Because one of the things that people don't have to realize is that there's things that are overhangs, and there are gaps in an object that something has to occur. So if there's negative space in an object, if it's hollow, how is that going to be translated out? Is the physical object going to be moved? So one of the areas that we've been working on a lot is getting kids to use Lego and paper to build an object using Lego and then think about it as a physical object and then use the digital aspects of it. So when we talk about 3D printing, we have we need to start evaluating it from start to finish, all the aspects of it. How is the object being designed? How is it coming out? In the slide of me showing the printed objects. One of the things that I always talk about is how is the printer working? How does it translate this? How does it produce the objects? And that's the thing that we've been really trying to get when we talk about these technologies within any context is a critical sense. How are these objects producing objects? Because this also leads us into interesting conversations with people about how does traditional means of manufacturing produce objects? One of the things that one of the roles of the library can be here really is to kind of have conversations of how are objects produced and how is traditional manufacturing and this new form of additive manufacturing different. And Gabby was talking about this idea of leveraging expertise. There's a lot of expertise that goes into producing these objects. You can use basic programs like 123D Design, Tinkercad. There's a great source of free stuff out there, but this gets really complicated really quickly. If you're talking about gear ratios, how many people have the expertise to design something that uses gear ratios? So it's learning to leverage these spaces and learning to leverage the knowledge basins of those around you that can actually start to use this technology in interesting, meaningful ways. The thing that you want to avoid is that having this technology just producing meaningless knickknacks. So this rubber squid's interesting for a bit, but how long can you actually keep a space alive when you're just producing tiny little rubber objects for people? Eventually the novelty wears off. So one of the challenges is teaching people not to just be consumers, teaching them how to become producers. And to be a producer, you need to understand how the technology is going to translate something out, as well as how to use the software and the hardware itself. And so that's kind of the challenge going forward, not only positioning these technologies in a meaningful, critical way, but also explaining the huge change that go with it, which is not a small process. It's quite a long one, but you get some really interesting conversations out of it. And the one last kind of thought that I'd like to leave you with, 3D printing right now remains very much in vogue. We've seen a lot of libraries move towards this technology because it has a lot of appeal to it. It has a very interesting mystique. It's very cool to play with, but there is something that we have to do. It has to be used in a meaningful way. So one of the challenges, and we kind of had this conversation earlier, with what is a makerspace? What defines a makerspace? And it's not just technology, it's not a specific technology, it's a whole host of activities. So when you're moving and designing these spaces, the question that I get a lot of the time from libraries is what 3D printer should we buy? And then the question I'll ask them is like, what's your budget? How are you kind of going forward? And then the response is that we're going to blow all our budget on 3D printers. And that's a really problematic stance to take, because for $3,000, the cost of a MakerBot, you can buy about 100 Raspberry Pis. So is it better to have a much larger makerspace that has an electronic side of things or physical side of things? It's really kind of coming to understand that while 3D printers are a really interesting and in vogue technology, they have these huge structures of learning how physical objects work. They're very complicated in the sense of getting them to move into something meaningful. And engaging community members in other ways might be a better source of the use of the makerspace. So maybe rather than buying a 3D printer, you should be looking at buying a dozen Raspberry Pis or a dozen Arduinos and having a much broader section of something, or even having a kitchen. I would argue that a kitchen or even some basic wood tools would classify itself as a makerspace. How are you using the space and what are you doing it for? It doesn't necessarily have to be a 3D printer. It could be something else. It could be something more meaningful to your community.
Yeah. So thanks, Dan. We're gonna get Sarah on because she's got to jump out by 2. One other thing I just want to add to what Dan was saying, we're still really, although there's about 25 plus years of anecdotal evidence about the non-negative health impact of 3D printing, the way it's used currently anyway. We're still somewhat in the Wild West when it comes to regulation, when it comes to health and safety issues. There's not a whole lot of good research out there on the long-term residual impact of the release of ultrafine particles from these machines. They are getting better, and but you know, it's something to be wary of, that if you have rare materials in your library, you may need to get a consultation over, you know, what could happen in the long run from residual impact of this kind of stuff. I mean, if you're in an enclosed space that's not very well ventilated, being around a constantly running 3D printer can be equivalent of smoking a cigarette. So it is something to be you know, to be aware of. The safety risks around, say, electronics hacking are not quite as high, so it's not something you should really worry about. But let's turn over to Sarah, and Sarah's going to talk to us a little bit about how to promote a culture of inquiry through hackathons. And if you guys want to jump ahead in your slides, there's a slide taken from one of her events at York.
Thanks, Gabby. Okay, so everybody can hear me, I believe, correct?
Yes.
Okay, good, great. So I just have 10 minutes because I got to go on the reference desk, and I just want to talk about my experience with organizing hackathons or hackfests, as they're also known as, in the last 2 years at the Stacy Library. And what I'm going to talk about can apply in an academic environment, but I also believe it applies to a public library and just kind of like the library role in society. So how many of you have ever been to a hackfest or hackathon before? Okay, so I'm hearing blank, so it doesn't sound like too many. Which is fine. When I organize one, I'll tell you this: I've never been to one before organizing one. I don't have coding experience. I mean, I'm starting to get interested in that, and I've taken a couple of courses or one course, but I myself had no experience, and that's okay. I think the ideas of your intentions going into building a hackfest or hackathon in the public library are what's really going to drive you, and what your expertise is in. So when Gabby mentioned, he mentioned like, well, hackathons or hackfests are usually kind of considered these like entrepreneurial events, and I want to argue that that's not necessarily true. And what, you know, the library isn't necessarily in the business of building entrepreneurs. The library is in the business of building more informed citizens, ones that can make informed decisions on technology or about their government officials. But the idea is that everybody equitably has access to these technologies and can make decisions on what they want to create and what they want to make and be part of that culture. So I think that's really important to have that mindset going into it. So one of the ways that the Stacy Library Hackfest, Dungeon Hackfest, I want to go through 4 tips about Hackfests and within that I'll talk about what the Stacy Library did in order to kind of foster these ideas of critical making, and that really can apply in a public environment as well. I'll just tell you a little bit about how the day of a Hackfest might look like, and you can decide if they're usually considered software development events that are marathon events. So they might be 24 hours or 48 hours, and that's not always feasible in an environment that closes after 8 o'clock, whatnot. So, for example, the Stacy Library, we did 2 days, 9 to 5, 9 to 5. And this year we're planning to change that to make the first day a little bit longer, so you can decide on your planning. The first day is usually the participants will already have some ideas of you'll have a theme, and participants will have an idea of, based on the theme, of ideas that they want to create or build, and they'll present this it could be in a very informal manner to a group of other participants, these ideas that they have. And as people kind of discuss these ideas that they have, and in the picture that you see on the slide that you see, that's actually the first part of the day where somebody's presenting their idea and people are giving feedback and talking back and forth. And then as people present the ideas, they start forming groups organically, and it kind of just happens magically. It's kind of really interesting how that happens. People give feedback. Well, have you heard of this? Maybe it's similar than that. Maybe you want to change that or whatnot. So they kind of go back and forth, and these groups start to form, and that's usually in the first half of the day, on day 1. And then they start forming groups, they start brainstorming, the groups start brainstorming by themselves, and by the latter part of the day, they're starting to code, or maybe they're working on design, or maybe they're working on a presentations or whatnot, but they're starting to develop their idea in code and whatnot. It's usually a more quieter period of the day. And throughout the day, you might have mentors, you might have some breakout sessions or some instructional sessions that might be useful to the theme or to the event. So those are things you might want to consider as well. So some of the tips that which Gabby has kind of touched upon too, and I'll go through these 4 tips and then kind of talk about what the Stacy Hackfest did. So the first one is uh, establishing a dedicated space for your event. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a makerspace. The Stacy Library doesn't have a makerspace yet. But the idea is that you have a dedicated floor of the library or a room, but you also want to make sure the public can see what's going on. So something that I've changed from the first Hackfest to the second Hackfest at Stacy Library is that you notice the name is the Stacy Library Dungeon Hackfest. So in the first year, participants were in the basement, hidden away. This past year, it was different. They were kind of scattered throughout. They were kind of scattered around mainly the first floor. The presentations in the beginning of the day to build ideas were actually done on the main part of the floor. So there were other people who might have heard that the public that might have been part of that in some sense. And the final presentations at the end of the Hackfest were also in a public area where other people can join in and listen and engage in what's going on at the library and this maker culture. So definitely having a dedicated space that's in public, that might even be public, might really help to kind of foster those ideas. That's what the Hackfest at the Stacy Library did. The second tip is you want to build relationships. In my case, I built with faculty and staff. So Gabby mentioned getting staff involved. You may not have faculty, but maybe you have educators or teachers from your local schools, or maybe you have some other partners around the neighborhood that you work with already, businesses or daycares or whatnot that you can educators that you can help get involved with that. So you may want to think of other people that you might want to ask, or maybe you have designers or other techie people that you might want to ask to come in. I know in Toronto we have an organization called Ladies Learning Code, and Gabby mentioned Kids Learning Code. So maybe there's somebody from there that can participate in that. So you definitely want to start building those relationships, and librarians are good at that. So that should be something that you'd be fine with in some sense. And the idea here is you want to get people not necessarily that are always engineering or science based. You might want to consider the A in STEAM. So you might want to consider somebody from the arts. So maybe you have a photographer that has a whole bunch of photographs that they need to help kind of organize and put on a website or something. And so they're going to do that. I know that one of there's a digital humanities group here at York who is looking to somehow take photographs that we have of York and get kind of like that citizen science idea where they have photographs and they want, the idea is to post it somewhere where people can identify where on campus those photos are from. So people are participating in that. So that's one of the Hackfest ideas that might be coming out in the upcoming Hackfest. So it doesn't necessarily always have to be a techie mentor or a techie faculty member. And so these people that you're building relationships with, you were going to want to ask them to be mentors throughout the whole Hackfest, if possible. You're going to want to ask them, and if they can't come throughout the whole hackathon or Hackfest, you'll hear me say both terms. Maybe ask them just to come for a few hours here and there. You also want to make sure that those mentors are also available at the final presentation. So at the end of the hackathon, there people might present what they did during the last few days. I want to just point out that that we kind of argue that Hackfests are not necessarily about creating a finished product. It's just more about coming together, collaborating on code, sharing code, and I should also point out that the Stacy Library Hackfest is not a competitive Hackfest, and that really helps to take it away from the entrepreneurial concept and kind of that competitive environment. So there are groups that are working together and also working apart. But the idea is there's that collaboration, and I think that's a really really important key to what makes a library hackfest different than other hackathons or other hackfests that you might see out there. And that again goes on the ideas of why a library exists and the idea of research as inquiry and also collaboration and learning from others. And so I think that's also really important. Sorry to trail off there.
Thank you, sir. I'm sorry to interrupt you. This is Amir again. We are running out of the time, and I would like if you willing to conclude your talk, and then we
Sure.
thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you.
No worries. So I'll move on from the second tip. The last two tips are, tip 3 is build upon the history of libraries, which we've already mentioned already. So the idea of engaged citizenship and collaboration. So maybe having a repository for that code where people can share that later on and whatnot. So that's what I was going to talk about there. And there's just a quote I had that free access to software tools is a prerequisite for the existence of a hacker community. And that comes from a book called Hacking Capitalism. And tip 4 is create an agenda that fosters critical literacies and not just necessarily digital literacy. So really think about what your theme is going to be. You may want to look at library data. You may have an open library data theme, and that really will help to promote the access to information for the community. So those are the type of themes that you might want to think about. And then the last couple of things I wanted to mention is libraries are also really great at creating book displays and providing book suggestions. So really incorporate your collections into the Hackfest and have a book display based on your theme of the hackathon and the ideas of open source and whatnot. So you may want to think about those themes as well. Gabby, is there anything else that you wanted that we talked about mentioning? But I think in the last few minutes, that's all I can really say. So we're running out of time.
That's totally fine. You've actually covered a couple of the concluding points that I wanted to make. Really just around remembering that libraries are about creating and fostering a sense of engaged citizenship, right? A real cornerstone of libraries is that they foster dialogue around decision making about politics or society or technology, just to name a couple of examples, that they are at their root about promoting good citizenship. And a way of promoting good citizenship is by promoting engaged citizenship. So that's why we have such an emphasis here around asking critical questions with the technology, not just using the technology to produce better products or produce things that we can monetize, but using the technology to help provide us with new insights or new avenues to sort of promote long-term socio-technical engagement and get a better understanding of, just to sort of wrap up and close on why we chose the title we did. What you don't want is a kind of model for a makerspace where your patrons come up and say, hey, librarian, make me this. You've got this cool technology, make this for me now. That's what you don't want. That's the worst model for a makerspace. And I don't think there are a lot of makerspaces that do that. But I think it's a risk that's becoming more and more common because people won't always expect to, or there won't always be an expectation that people will take the time to participate. And what you want is not a culture of technology. You want a culture of participation. You really want people getting involved and being a part of this initiative. And then hopefully they'll gain a deeper appreciation for why the library actually is a great home for maker culture and why the library actually is a great home for this kind of technology. So that's all we really wanted to focus on. Thanks so much, Sarah. I know you've got to get back to work, but thanks for chiming in. And
Thank you.
Dan and I are still here. If any of you guys in Regina have some questions that you want to fire our way, or if you have any like detailed technical questions, we've, as you could probably see, we've got a pile of stuff around our lab that we can probably show off a little bit. But I know you guys are probably getting antsy and might want to go get coffee or something. So.
I really appreciate. Thank you very much, Sarah and Gabby, and it was
Thank
great.
you, Amir.
Thank you very much. We will be in touch for sure, and it will be a future program, and for sure we would love to see you there. But thank you so much for being part of this program.
For sure. And we also welcome, if you guys have any particular questions about technologies or about you know, what you might outfit. I mean, one thing I would definitely recommend is get in touch with Innisfil Public Library here in Ontario. To me, they've got one of the most successful models for how to run this kind of thing. And Chattanooga Public Library in Tennessee, Nate Hill, who runs that show, is just doing a fantastic job. So I would strongly recommend that you get in touch with them as well, or at least look at, you know, check out their blogs and things and see what they've been up to. But yeah, I mean, as far as like Canadian technology and that kind of stuff, if you guys have any interest, don't hesitate to get in touch. And thanks for giving us the opportunity. Hopefully, you know, all the best of luck with getting this stuff underway. Hopefully, anyone who's there, if any of you guys are looking to create these initiatives, hopefully you guys have a good sense about how to do it.
Yes, no, there was a lot of people here and they interested and they found that your presentation was fantastic. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Take
you.
care.